Live streaming is on.
Good afternoon. It's a net zero impossible goal, Tales from the Cities and Regions time. On this, the second day of the Dcarbonise Week Virtual Sustainability Summit. It's a pre-COP26 event that features stellar lineups, and this one most certainly is. All of them are on highly topical and relevant panels. I'm Judith Patton, Project Director and co-creator of All Energy and the co-located Dcarbonise. With no in-person All Energy since 2019, we've run a compelling series of webinars, 30 between May 2020 and March of this year. Over 18,000 registered, and the webinars received over 20,000 views. We're just over halfway through the All Energy Dcarbonise contribution to Dcarbonise Week and delighted by the number of people who found time to be with us. By first thing this morning, well over 130 had registered for this particular session. Sadly, we're without one of our speakers. Holly Billington was with us during our technical briefing session and had to go away because of a family emergency. We wish her and her family member well. One small housekeeping point. Check out what lies behind the Resources tab. You can see what is up next, find a full program link, the digital bag, and information on next May's All Energy and the co-located Dcarbonise. 11th to 12th of May at Glasgow's SEC are the dates for your diary. Naturally, we'd like to thank our sponsors, and for the first 3 days, these include our brand sponsors, Scottish Power, Shepherd and Wedderburn, who are sponsoring this particular session as well, and Earthbid. Their names appear alongside certain sessions close to their hearts. And I know that this is something very important to our chair for this session. And then our session sponsors too, we thank Hitachi ABB Power Grids, Kellis Midstream, SSEN Transmission, SWEP, and Driving the Electric Revolution Industrialization Centres. And thank you for being with us today, speakers and the audience. We hope that if you enjoy the session, which I'm sure you will, you'll also let your colleagues know that they can watch on demand. Now, without more ado, I'd like to pass over to a great friend of All Energy, Claire Foster of Shepherd and Wedderburn. Claire is head of clean energy and a partner in the banking team at the law firm. She's also a commissioner on the Edinburgh Climate Commission. So, Claire, it's over to you as the chair. Have a good time.
Judith, thank you for the kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone, and I hope you're well. The weather here in Edinburgh this afternoon is absolutely dreadful, so I'm hoping that this session will bring a little sunshine into my and your afternoon. And with that, I bid you a very warm welcome to this afternoon's session on Net Zero, Impossible Goal, Tales from the Cities and Regions. Now, Judith has done a marvellous job of introducing me already, and my day job, or jobs, as partner at law firm Shepherd and Wedderburn, and also as a commissioner on the Edinburgh Climate Commission. But more importantly, for today's purposes, I have the pleasure of being your chairperson, and I'm in a unique position, having chaired a Sustainable Cities session at All Energy every year since 2015. And yet, in the 6 years I've been speaking about this, we still have not found the silver bullet which will allow our cities and places to decarbonise at scale and speed across the UK. I'm hoping that it's not a reflection on my chairing skills, but rather indicative of the challenges of achieving a deliverable, sustainable decarbonisation strategy that works effectively for the 32 local authorities across Scotland, the 343 local authorities in England, 22 in Wales, and 11 local government districts in Northern Ireland. And I'm sure we'll return to those stats and why they go some way to explaining the disaggregation challenge and perhaps the glacial pace in some areas. So if I can take a moment to set the scene for the discussion this afternoon, You will all be familiar with the statutory targets that we have here for net zero. UK government selected 2050 as the target for achieving net zero, and the Scottish government went further with a more ambitious 2045 net zero target. But in addition to those statutory targets, a number of our cities across the UK have declared a climate emergency and have gone even further with a 2030 target for net zero or carbon neutrality. Thinking about the city targets set for London, Edinburgh and Glasgow as examples of cities who have committed to the 2030 target, think about that for a moment. That's 9 years away. Suddenly the climate emergency stands front and centre and needs to be addressed now. It's no longer a case of saying we have time to get to net zero, and we need to take transformational action today. So why isn't it happening? Well, aside from Brexit and COVID, and we're currently in the midst of an energy crisis with suppliers falling over at an alarming rate, my worry is that collaboration across the UK seems to be in the too difficult box for many. And whilst there's pockets of best practice in a number of cities, there doesn't appear to be a uniform approach in how projects are scoped, structured, funded and executed. And we know that some of the challenges facing many cities and places are enormous. The issues around, for example, decarbonisation of heat and transport are not just about technology, but are interweaved with procurement, contractual structures, risk allocation, funding, and collaboration with the private sector. And each city, region, or place will have its own anomalies and unique challenges. But we need to establish some benchmarks if we have any hope of achieving sustainability in our cities and regions. And collaboration is going to be crucial. Collaboration not only between public and private sector, but among public sector bodies. This can lead to the scale and aggregation that we so badly need. This would lead to more interest from developers, investors and funders, and more capital flowing into the places to expand, regenerate and modernise and create the jobs that we need in the UK. Imagine the potential for synergies from multi-sector, whole-of-city projects which are replicated across the UK. The prize is enormous, but will we get there? For those of you whom I have saddened already with my frustrations over progress to date, don't be disheartened, and let me give you an example which illustrates that some cities are taking action already. In Edinburgh, the Edinburgh Climate Commission has developed the Edinburgh Climate Compact. So we've created a platform to allow businesses and organisations, and by that I mean public, private and third sector, to come together to commit to taking certain actions to tackle climate change, to share that best practice and to provide a unique opportunity for Scotland's capital to show what might be possible through teamwork and collaboration in addressing the climate emergency. This had never been done before in Scotland, and underpinning the compact is the desire to help facilitate a green recovery, which is a win-win in terms of decarbonisation, but also helping to get the economy back on track in a sustainable way. The compact model has been adopted by Glasgow, which now has the Sustainable Glasgow Green Economy Hub Charter, and you may hear more about that later. And we've also spoken to a number of cities across Scotland with a view to them adopting the compact where they are. So momentum is building with a commonality of goals, and the next step is to move to that next stage of evolution with projects and working on projects together that will get us to net zero by 2030. So I'm ending my introduction with a positive note, albeit tinged with a healthy dose of anxiety. Now this brings me to the hugely talented panel sitting patiently waiting to speak. And I'll give very brief intros for each of our panel members, recognising that the biographies for each are actually on the All Energy website. So if you want to hear more about all of us, please go there. And frankly, we need the time to get stuck into the debate. So may I introduce in the order in which they're going to speak. Firstly, Jonathan Guthrie, Partnership Director of Robertson Group and Edinburgh Climate Compact Champion. He'll be followed by Shirley Rodriguez, Deputy Mayor for Environment and Energy for the Greater London Authority. Shirley will then pass on to Guy Jefferson, Chief Operating Officer of SP Energy Networks. As well as being an Edinburgh Climate Compact Champion, Guy is also Chair of the Glasgow Green Economy Hub and was instrumental in setting up the Sustainable Glasgow Charter. And finally, Stephen Veer, Programme Director, Net Zero, of the Scottish Futures Trust. Welcome to all of my panel members. Now, I've asked each of the panel members to give a short presentation with their preliminary thoughts, hopefully limiting that to no more than 5 minutes for each of you. And then the plan is to launch into our Q&A session. I'm not proposing to speak in between each of the panel presentations in the interest of keeping things moving, and so we can get to the Q&A session more quickly. And so if I may now hand over to Jonathan Guthrie of Robertson Group to kick off proceedings. Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Claire, and thank you very much for having me along today to talk. So is net zero an impossible goal? Well, I would say it's not impossible, but it is a challenge. Over the last few days, I've been really impressed, actually, at the number of social media posts when it's working, commenting on running the London Marathon. Almost every single post that I've seen has referred to the support from their family, from the team, from the crowd, from the organisers, and many other kinds of people. So doing difficult things is easier when we do them together. Net zero is a difficult thing, there is no doubt about that, otherwise we'd have done it by now. To briefly explain, though, our journey at Robertson and our approach to net zero, I'd just like to explain it in the form of 2 words: shaping and sharing. So in terms of shaping, over the years at Robertson, we have been shaping our proposition, shaping our organisation, our processes, shaping the approach that we take so that we have become a much lower carbon organisation than we were. We're very proud of our progress, and we're very proud of the external accreditations that demonstrate that this has been a worthwhile journey. Along the way, we have tested and we have trialled and we have reported, we've done a bit more testing and more. We've worked with governments, we've worked with cities and towns, we've worked with our customers, we've worked with academics, with suppliers, we've worked with sources of finance and funding. We've been developing low carbon, long-term responsible methods to deliver for our customers. So we have engaged in citywide pilots, we have engaged in product testing, we've engaged in regional innovation programs. And these projects have all given us the confidence to then pass that on to our customers, to our partners, and to local governments that we work with. So much so that we're now working to normalise the low carbon conversation. In a very short time, net zero and long-term responsible delivery will just be the norm. These will not be things that customers have to ask for or pay extra for. These are just, or will be just, the norm. Which brings me to the second word, sharing. Sharing has become a really big deal for us. Who do we share with? Well, having been through these journeys, we're very keen to share with everybody that we meet. So to make that final jump to being a net zero organisation, it sounds a bit like going into hyperspace, doesn't it? Make that final jump to being that net zero organisation, we need to take the supply chain and the subcontractor network with us. However, the supply chain needs to grow. It needs to become more local. And it can only do that if the long-term work is committed to by those that fund it and those that commission it. If the pipeline is there, then those supply chains and those subcontractor networks will invest in themselves. At a city region scale, the Edinburgh Climate Compact that Claire mentioned has given us the opportunity to share across many sectors, not just our own sector, the net zero journey that we're on. It's also given us the ability to share the gains that some of our customers in other regions have made. In turn, the other climate champions have been generous to share their journey and what they've been able to gain. We're also actively engaged in a number of organisations like this, as Claire mentioned, but also including Dundee and Aberdeen, Bolton, Stockport, many more. So why have we been open to share all of this with our customers across towns and across cities? Because we feel it's the only way that Scotland as a whole will go towards its net zero future at a pace that was possibly felt impossible, that was possibly felt to be impossible at first. To do big things, to meet big challenges, needs support from partners. whether it's running a marathon or whether it's delivering net zero. To do these things quickly and at scale, which are not words that we commonly use in the UK, means doing things differently. We are keen to share our experience in delivering low carbon solutions, taking our towns and cities towards their net zero goals. Let's hand over now and listen to Shirley Rodriguez, the Deputy Mayor for Environment and Energy at the Greater London Authority. Shirley, over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan. So is net zero an impossible goal for cities and local authorities? I don't think so, but there are going to be massive challenges. The next 2 months are obviously vital for London and all of us, as we see, for example, in London, the expansion of our ultra-low emission zone. We have COP26 in Glasgow, and we're obviously trying to ensure the city's recovery from the pandemic is implemented in a way that really tackles those economic and social impacts we've all felt. And of course, you've seen more and more data coming out about the situation we're in, the IPCC findings, for example, from last month, showing that we're on track for a 2.7 degrees temperature rise by the end of the century, not the to. So for all of these reasons, the Mayor has accelerated his ambition for London to be a net zero carbon city from 2050 to 2030. And as I've said, there are some challenges to doing this. It's a very challenging target, we know that, but we have to try. So one of the things that we're really focusing on is how do we deal with adaptation and experience the climate impacts that we're already facing. So we talk a lot about mitigation, but actually we've just seen it overnight, surface water flooding events. We've had heat events this summer and previously. Just two of the key areas that the cities, London is experiencing. And of course, they don't affect Londoners equally or fairly. So understanding those climate impacts and then using that to respond and plan, really, we need to understand what the existing inequalities are. We've published recently a climate risks map for London to identify areas of London that are most exposed to climate impacts, where there are high concentrations of the vulnerable populations. And we're using this to target our funding, for example, from the Mayor's Green New Deal Fund, and also helping other organisations, working with them to deliver more equitable responses. The Green New Deal mission has as its target doubling the size of London's green economy. We've established a collaborative mechanism post-pandemic, a London Recovery Board, and it really echoes some of the comments that Jonathan made, really, that we have to do this together. We can't do this alone. And this board is co-chaired by the Mayor and the Chair of London Councils, doubling the green economy, but using that to really target issues that we know that we will have to develop, such as the new skills that we need in London, and making sure that those hardest hit by the pandemic can secure those good jobs. The Mayor set aside funding to help establish a series of academies, skills academies, to train Londoners in these new green jobs, from engineering for heat pumps, retrofitting, digital and other skills, because we want to see a just transition to that low carbon economy. Because we've accelerated our 2030 target, we're just updating our pathway modelling, and we're just looking to see whether we need to change the approach that we've taken. I don't think we do, but we might need to accelerate certain areas, obviously. But some of the things that we've already been doing, which I expect we'll carry on doing, are focusing on the built environment. So, for example, our new London plan requires all new buildings to be net zero, and that's already seen a carbon savings of 46% over those required by national building regulations. We've been working on retrofitting our existing stock, so securing funding from government, but also establishing a new partnership, an innovation partnership, a retrofit revolution, to help social landlords and putting them together with UK building firms to really perform whole house deep retrofits in social housing. This is what we're going to need to reach net zero. And this obviously has huge potential, 150,000 jobs over the decade if we do this right. We have the biggest electric fleet in Western Europe in London. And last month, the Mayor announced that all new buses that we procure in London will now be electric, which means we'll have a total electric fleet by 2034, all 9,000 buses. And with government support, we can make that 2030. And of course, as I mentioned, we're extending the ultra-low emission zone, an air quality initiative, but also helps reduce carbon emissions. And that zone is being extended to 18 times its current size. But of course, all of this needs to be funded. We're looking to develop new funding models, a new financing facility to help move the private sector investment into the infrastructure that we need to get to London to net zero and develop a supply chain. So we're developing a new London financing facility to catalyse that private sector finance. And in terms of powers, I know Polly would have said this, that we need powers at a local level in order for us to take the action that our citizens want and want us to accelerate. In London, for example, we only have powers over half the emission savings we need to make. Government has the powers over the rest. If we were given more powers, we can accelerate, for example, setting minimum energy efficiency standards and enforcing them, or devolving eco-funding so that we can do more retrofitting and also tackle the huge fuel poverty challenge we face in London. So that new devolution settlement and the new sort of net local zero powers bill that UK 100 have been talking about is needed, so that all layers of government can really work together. And of course, what would be really great is if government were to publish its net zero strategies as soon as possible, so that gives us the certainty of action, but also the private sector, so they can plan the supply chains and their investment. So just in conclusion, we've taken big strides in London. We're not alone. Many cities and local authorities across the country are doing the same, but we have to do much more. And COP26 isn't going to be the end point. It really has to be seen to be a re-energising and accelerating of our actions, so that we can really secure the future we all want to see. So thanks for allowing me to speak. I'm going to hand over now to Guy to do his speech.
Thanks, Shirley, and apologies for joining by phone due to technical difficulties. My name's Guy Jefferson, Chief Operating Officer of SP Energy Networks. You can hopefully see from my title slide we cover Central Scotland in terms of a networks provider, operate, maintain and add to the electricity network in between St Andrews and Stranraer, and in the northwest of England, Liverpool and North Wales and Cheshire. Obviously within that we have 3 large cities, and that's why I'm here to talk to you today with regard to the challenges that we face and why we think it's important for cities to have their own voice when it comes to deciding and prioritising infrastructure to deliver against the net zero challenge. Moving to the next slide, just at a general level, the challenge that we have from a networks perspective is 4-dimensional. Capacity is obviously a huge issue. We hope in the short term that efficiency means that the use of electricity may well go down, but as time progresses, that's only going to increase. Huge power flows through our network beyond what it's currently designed for across the UK. There'll be more complexity. The system used to be very simple. The electricity flowed from large power stations on the left through to customers on the right, with not a lot in between. That's changing every day. Much more complexity in terms of the dynamic nature of the network, with embedded generation and prosumers at the end instead of customers who have their own solar power, for example, their own batteries, and can generate their own power. Customers who can generate their own power and export onto the grid. So a huge challenge for us. Criticality, we've become more and more reliant on electricity as time progresses. We used to, on top of all of the responsibilities we had prior, we're now at the forefront of decarbonisation of transport and heat, which means that our networks and electricity becomes more important to the end user every day. And that's all done within an infrastructure which is ageing and deteriorating, no matter how much we invest. Due to the size of the asset base, that is a challenge. I don't want to frighten anybody, but that's the challenge that we face. But we're up for it. We've got robust forecasts, good models, good asset management systems, and we are now looking at new solutions, not just putting cable and transformers in the ground, but also looking at flexibility for load-related requirements, which offers an alternative to the traditional asset investment. And that can all be done very safely and efficiently if we do it in a planned way. Just to give an example for a city, the next slide, our distribution future energy scenarios illustrate the challenge we've got on our patch, which is along the top in terms of vehicles, heating and generation, some huge numbers there. If you look specifically in Glasgow, as an example city, but this could be either Edinburgh, Liverpool, or many other cities of a similar size across the UK. In Glasgow, nearly 100,000 electric vehicles will come on the system by 2030, 44,000 heat pumps, and over 150 megawatts of distributed generation that have to be accommodated in a typical city, which is obviously a big change from where we are just now. But that's what we are developing against, and that's why we need decision-making processes locally in each city, which allow them to develop at their pace for the needs that they have. Very briefly, in terms of the next slide, again taking Glasgow as an example, it's not just the power requirements, it's what we need to do to accommodate those power requirements. So that slide, I won't go through in great detail, but the infrastructure does need space. So typically, a grid site which offers up to 100 megawatts in terms of power could be 100 metres squared. Where do you put that in an urban environment? Primary sites, which could be 5 or 6 or 7 for Glasgow over the coming years. Again, 35 metres squared, where do you put that in an urban environment? So these are the sort of things that have to be fed in and planned properly for over the next few years. My final slide, that's the practical considerations, but my final slide around stakeholders and prioritising investment is absolutely vital. Each city has a massive part to play in terms of coordinating that infrastructure. It's not just the electricity infrastructure, it's other vectors as well in terms of hydrogen, for example. In Glasgow, again, to use that as an example, under the banner of Sustainable Glasgow, there has been significant work around infrastructure, and you can see there the amount of stakeholders that need to be involved in those discussions. Obviously ourselves, but various other partners, and these are just a few. And the themes that they bring in terms of the challenges and the drivers, again, is illustrated on that slide to the right in terms of the different areas that we need to make sure we plan for. To summarise, this needs to be owned and coordinated within the city. It needs to incorporate the local authorities' planning across all the sectors. We need to make sure there's a whole system approach. And while all of this is going on, there's a huge amount of different dynamics here. The uncertainty that is inevitable at this stage should not stop action. There are investments we can make now ahead of need, which will be required at some point over this journey that we're on over the next 20 years. So if we're not sure about investing for electrification of vehicles, for example, do we think that capacity will be taken up? Well, yes, it will. If it's not by electrification of transport, it will be by the electrification, decarbonisation of heat. So we need to move on, and we need to move forward, and we need to make decisions now and invest now to ensure that our cities are ready for that net zero future. That's my summary, so I'm going to hand it over now to Stephen, who's going to take you to the next section. Stephen.
Thanks, Guy. Net zero impossible goal. My short answer to that would be it's not impossible, but we all are really going to have to up our game if we're going to get there. If it was a school report card, it would read something like mine at school, which would be needs to do better or could do better. An ex-colleague of mine, his name was Sam Castles, used to specialise in the place agenda. And he used to say to me, if you can't solve a problem, make it bigger. And it strikes me now that more than ever applies to our net zero ambitions. We're not going to achieve them by focusing on decarbonisation alone. We need to focus on place. Only by creating the communities where people want to live and bring up their families and invest are we going to get our communities to buy into decarbonisation. People won't buy into net zero targets alone, particularly if it's going to be costing them more and they're not seeing the visual benefits from it. I think Guy's presentation there really showed that interaction between heat decarbonisation and transport and the importance for that whole place agenda and planning and coordinating our investment. Now, this is a very different challenge from what we've faced in the past because it's in many ways all-encompassing. It involves the public sector, involves the private sector, involves domestic, non-domestic. It's about infrastructure, but it's also very much about behavioural change, and that makes it all about what I would call a squidgy. And that's not a technical term, but I think it is squidgy. There's no one organisation to hold all the levers, and it's going to need collaboration, as Jonathan mentioned, and that collaboration between people, organisations, supply chains and customers. So it's all very complex. For me, the public sector have a responsibility to show leadership, and that's not because of the size of their estate. You know, the estate is relatively small. I'd probably say 3%, for example, of the wider estate, but it's because they hold some of the levers that can allow the first stages to happen and give the supply chain the confidence to invest. It's much more than about setting targets. We need a systems approach, and we can't have what I often see as a solution for a building, but there are 23,000 public sector buildings in Scotland, and the UK, who knows, probably 10 times that, 230,000. And we need systems, we need heat networks. We can't tackle this on a building by building basis. One of the key points I'd like to make is regulation's coming, but we can't rely upon regulation because it's probably going to take 5 years till it has any real bite, and even then it probably won't have enough punch. Meanwhile, if you're even thinking at the early stages of thinking about building a heat network, it takes about 5 years from having those initial scoping thoughts through to delivery. And with targets like 2030, we just can't wait to be doing this thing. Now, people often tell me this is really difficult, and no doubt it is, but my experience has been fortune favours the brave. One observation I've got is that there are certain local authorities out there that are far more successful than others, and it's interesting to think who they are and why they are. And in many ways, it's those that understand the landscape, they have strong networks, they understand the politics around this, and they understand where the funding and the levers sit, and they understand how to structure projects and access that funding. The good news is, over the next 5 years, there will be a relatively significant amount of capital subsidy for projects, and there is private finance available, and organisations such as in Scotland, the Scottish National Investment Bank, who are willing to invest. What we don't have is what I would call a large number of investable propositions. By that I mean projects that have clear revenue streams, they're using proven technologies, they have appropriate risk share and levels of risk and return, and they have scale, and they also have a pipeline of projects so that investors can see it's not just that one project, but it will lead on to future projects. As regulation comes into play, we are going to need different models to get the scale of investment we need. We're going to need things like regulated asset base, where you can give financiers certainty over large-scale investment by offering them a steady return. What I consistently hear is lacking is capacity and capability. That's capacity and capability within local government, within central government, but it's also supply chain. And I was even hearing from someone this morning that there's a lack of capacity within consultancy businesses, and I believe that is true itself. We're also going to have to, for that reason, we're going to have to think about very different models. I think in order to get the skills in, we're going to have to think about partnerships and things like joint ventures, where you know what you want to achieve, you don't quite know how you're going to get there. And so rather than procuring the assets, you procure partners to bring in the appropriate resources and expertise to help you progress the projects to the agreed outcomes and goals. But I would say over the years, I've seen a lot of ESCOs been set up without actually working out what the outputs are they're going to deliver. And I think before you procure a partner, you need to know what you're procuring them for and what the ultimate outcomes are going to be. My final observation is I think this will happen. And the reason I think it will happen is because it's no longer about the geeks in the corner. Now, we need those geeks. Those geeks are really important to us, but it's much more diverse. If I take my own organisation as an example, the whole organisation now sees net zero as a priority and in some way are working on delivering it. you can see it with the consultants. It's no longer the technical consultants that are focusing on this, but it's the top of the agenda for financiers and lawyers. And when you know they've got it at the top of their agenda, you know they can see changes coming and things are about to happen. So to sum up, this is achievable, but we're all really going to have to up our game. I'll now hand back to Claire, who's chairing the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Stephen. And thanks to Shirley and Jonathan as well, and to Guy, who I can't see on screen, but I know is here, a heavenly voice from above. There's a huge amount to unpick in all of this, and I think what scares me more than anything is no one has really said anything to lessen my anxiety. You know, we talk about the fact that the UK can't reach net zero without local authorities across the country, and that's north and south of the border, Wales and Northern Ireland too, and that we need this whole systems place-based approach. I guess my question is, you know, we talk about 2030 as though it's actually quite far away, and it really isn't. I know from a legislative perspective, you can't get legislation passed quickly. So how achievable is this whole systems place-based approach when we've got different administrations taking different approaches? How do we get that commonality of approach in place? Stephen, if I can ask you for your thoughts on that first instance before I ask some of the other panel members, please.
Claire, I think I made the point, and you make the point that I don't see regulation is absolutely required, and this isn't going to happen without it. But I don't see that being in place for probably the next 5 years to any significant degree, and I also don't think we can wait on it. But I see it very much as a game of two halves, in the sense of it's about the next 5 years. It's about working with what we have and the subsidy and the levers available and creating that pipeline of projects. But also, while we're doing that, in parallel, there's a coordination role needed. So there is a planning across your cities and towns, and understanding where are we having heat networks, where are we going to have heat pumps, and how are these going to be delivered. So I see almost two sides to it. I think the big challenge right now, if I speak about Scotland, and I'm sure it applies across the UK, the big challenge right now is everyone knows that planning and coordination is needed. What's not been answered is who's taking responsibility for it, and how are we getting that capacity and capability into those organisations to allow that to happen.
Yeah, and Shirley, I'm keen on your views on all of this, because you'd mentioned Polly's suggestion for a net zero local powers bill, which I know you've discussed with Polly at length. How do you think that could potentially alleviate the situation? Because London's got an enormous challenge on its hand.
Well, it would help mandate and provide the sort of supporting powers for people to take action. But I agree that it will be a while before we get governments, you know, even if they were to agree, legislative time. So we have to work with what we've got. And I mentioned, I think, in my remarks that we've set up a recovery board across London, you know, sort of to help London recover from the pandemic. And that is encouraging much greater collaboration than we've ever had before in London, between strategic authority at the mayoral level, local authority level, with our academic institutions, with our business community. And we've agreed on sort of 9 missions, one of which is the Green New Deal mission, but one is about recovering the high streets, one is about providing a safety net for people, you know, as the universal credit uplift is taken away and furlough ends. So these are things that are actually moving, probably faster than we've seen before, definitely not as fast as we need to see, given that 2030 target. But for example, we met a few weeks ago, we've agreed to work towards an announcement next spring at a retrofit summit on what can London do to really accelerate action on both homes retrofit, social housing retrofit, and workplace retrofit. And there are lots of things that are happening already in London, but you know, how do we pull together to the markets and others about that sort of pipeline investable projects, you know, the agglomeration challenge and so on, whilst we sort of lobby continuously government for the powers and funding that we need.
Mm-hmm. And Jonathan, from your perspective, you're at the sharp end of this because you're in the supply chain as a major construction company in Scotland. You know, it's quite clear from what's been said so far, we can't wait for legislation and regulation. We kind of need to crack on and do it. But is your experience that there's the confidence to do that at the moment based on what's in place at the moment?
Thank you very much for the question. I would say, in part, there is a confidence, but generally there's not. And what I mean by that is there are pockets where there is a confidence to push the button and maybe doing a pilot, for instance. Perhaps there's a particular focus on decarbonising a sector, say social and affordable housing. So let's do a pilot on that. But once you get into the realms of, well, that works, this is how you do it, here's the kitted parts, here's the funding structure, rolling that out doesn't have any confidence. And then there's also the supply chain issue with that, where as soon as you go large on something like that, where do you get the kit from? Are we willing to push the button and import, ironically, all this the insulation materials and decarbonisation materials and bits of kit for new heating systems, etc., from abroad? Or are we going to give signal now to our supply chain that this is coming in the next 12 months or 18 months so that they can then start to invest in themselves? So I think there is confidence there to do small things, but there isn't yet confidence to do it at a large scale. And I think the only way that's going to happen, as has been said by some of my fellow speakers here, is by working together and by learning from one another. Do it once and do it well, and then allow other people to use that.
And Guy, from your perspective with Scottish Power Energy Networks, I mean, your slides were fascinating, just showing all the relevant stakeholders who are involved in the debate. I mean, herding cats is the analogy that springs to mind, but do you think this is achievable based on where we are at the moment, without someone coming along and saying, actually, we'll need to legislate and just do a wholesale change across the country?
Yeah, I agree with our other speakers today that we can't afford to wait for that to happen. I think it will happen, but it's going to take time, as it always does with regulation and policy making. So I'd like to shine a little bit of hope. I know you're worried, Claire, but
I'm always worried.
I would like to give a little bit of hope in that we are working very hard with our regulator, Ofgem. We've lobbied for years with regard to getting ahead of the curve, if you like, and investing ahead of need. Recently, we've agreed a package with Ofgem, and we were allowed to go outside our current price review. We were a regulated business, and actually promote investable projects, to use a phrase again which has been used today. And in our patch, we've got £60 million extra over the next 2 years to invest in projects which support the sustainability theme. For example, we've now got a new primary substation being constructed in south of the river here in Glasgow to deliver first bus with a new EV charging scheme, which will be revolutionary for buses in Glasgow and get them towards the targets that they've got in terms of net zero 2030 that we've been talking about. So I think with lots of hard work, lobbying hard and working with our regulators, then we can invest ahead of need and we can get ahead of the game. A long way to go, but I do see a movement starting to happen, but we need to keep pushing at it.
And I guess the follow-on question for me in all of this is the investment piece in infrastructure. Guy, you've articulated very well Scottish Power's commitment to do that, but obviously to decarbonise the whole of the UK from a city perspective is going to cost billions. We know that the financial sector are keen to help. We know that there's plenty of liquidity in the market to make that happen. But how do we actually get to this position of incentivising investment in that infrastructure? Guy, can I maybe ask you to comment on that in the first instance, because it comes back to the whole public-private partnership type arrangement and the investment models, and I'll maybe then come to Stephen afterwards to talk about delivery models that could help.
Yeah, I'd probably echo some of the sentiments we've already heard. Again, I'll use that investable projects. I know here in Glasgow, for example, we've now created a green print, which is, I think £30 billion worth of projects, which, while they might not be the finished product, they're certainly projects which we need to deliver here in Glasgow, and they'll be the same in every city in order to deliver that net zero challenge. It might take a little longer than 9 years for all that investment, but I think that cities are now starting to show that ambition in terms of these are the things we need to do, and starting to deliver some of these projects. And the one I mentioned about First Bus is one of those projects. So I think that we need to promote these. We need to look at how we use the public purse to its most effective. But also within that, we do need the partnership and the private investors to come in and be attracted by these projects. And I think that's what needs. We need to take the green print, for example, and we need to develop it further and address some of the issues that Stephen talked about with regard to the detail of the project and the returns on these projects. But I am starting to see that chink of light, and starting to see at least some projects that we can start to work together with the city councils in order to develop further.
Mm-hmm. And Stephen, from your perspective, you're obviously in the thick of it at SFT in terms of coming up with some of the delivery models and innovation. Now, you mentioned the regulated asset base. Not the most simple of structures, to be fair. And I guess one of my questions is, are there other ways of trying to expedite the low-hanging fruit, whether that's retrofitting, social housing stock or doing other things? Part of the dilemma for me in all of this, coming from a financing background, is, it's very easy to get banks to commit to funding offshore wind or onshore wind or hydro projects because it's something tangible and it's energy generation on a clean basis. But when you're talking about decarbonisation, it's very difficult to articulate the revenue streams, the possibilities of why this should be attractive beyond the kind of social endeavour perspective. What's your take on that?
Thanks, Claire. Like you, I believe that there are investors out there. I don't believe there's a shortage of those willing to invest. What there is a shortage of, as I said earlier, is investable propositions. Now, that revenue stream you talk about, what I'd call it is investors need demand assurance. They need to know that if they're going to make an investment, that someone is going to be able to commit that revenue stream that will allow that investment to be paid back, and allow them to make a reasonable return. Now, to be honest, it comes back to this regulation point. I see it as a game of two halves. Until we've got the regulation in place, it's going to be largely down to subsidy to support projects, trying to go back to what I said earlier about the public sector. The public sector can give some demand assurance. They can give the confidence that they will, for example, be a heat off-taker for an anchor heat network project. But quite honestly, it's very tough right now. I was this morning on a call with some people talking about a possible project in an area of Scotland, and on paper it looked like a fantastic project until we got to the point where we said, and who's gonna commit to be actually operating the heat network? Who's going to guarantee the revenue stream that will allow the investment? And who's going to take that risk and potential return? And then you're looking around the table at everyone, and you're realizing everyone's agreeing this should happen, but no one is willing to step forward and actually say, we want this to happen, and we are willing to be the people responsible for delivering that network. Now, the private sector could do it, as Jonathan would say, the private sector could do it, but they still need that committed revenue stream. And until that revenue stream is there, we're going to need the other levers like grant subsidy, guarantees over revenue, etc. We're going to need someone willing to take this risk. Once regulation comes into play, I think it's a different matter. If you do things like zoning and say within this area we'll have a heat network, or within this area, even if we won't commit to customers joining a heat network, or at least say there's only one provider of a heat network in that area, that's when you start to get the private sector able to say, okay, well, we can get some confidence that we can build that revenue stream. And that's where I was saying, for example, regulated asset base. I know it's very complicated, but there are clever lawyers, Claire, like yourselves, I'm sure could help with it. And that's where you start to say, okay, we can give some comfort over those risks around how these returns are going to be made to allow that investment to flow. As I said earlier, game of two halves. Subsidy, guarantees, soft loans probably up front in order to get the returns to a level where you can also attract private investment, and longer term regulation that will give that demand assurance. I hope that wasn't too long.
No, that's perfect. And Shirley, I have to bring you in at this point because you must have gone through a similar thought process in London, given that you were talking about the Green Finance Institute being instructed to look at options for a facility. Is it the case that there is a recognition that actually all roads lead back to some sort of government body, whether it be central government or a devolved government, providing a guarantee, underwriting the debt, or otherwise providing some form of subsidy support?
Well, we're still working out the options. We have about 6 at the moment, and we'll be testing that with the finance sector over the next few weeks, really, just to see what their appetite is. But you know, I agree. You know, the issue of risk guarantee, you know, that long-term revenue stream, they're all issues in play. And I think, you know, we have now the UK infrastructure that we would love to have a net zero carbon mandate, you know, to help us with, you know, to help us in London and other places, I think, as well. So I think, you know, we're all struggling with this, and it's an issue that I've been dealing with in previous lives, with, you know, at a previous COP indeed, about the issue of sort of how do you get finance flowing, and it has to be a mix of the public and the private sector. It can't just be public alone, it can't be private alone. We've been looking at that, you know, for example, on our electric vehicle infrastructure in London. We have a third of the EV points in the UK, partly because of policy, partly because of government funding that we've really deployed successfully in London. But the idea when we started on this journey was that by now the private sector would be taking up the, you know, taking the reins now and rushing ahead, and yet they're not there. So we've just gone through a process now where we're coming up with a new strategy to try and, you know, to encourage and help facilitate the private sector coming in more easily, more quickly, and we'll be making an announcement on that, you know, over the next couple of weeks. But, you know, we're still far off what we need to be. So really it comes back down, I think, to government sort of, again, providing us with those sort of guarantees in order for us to, and the private sector, to be able to get on and implement this infrastructure, which we need a lot of it ahead of time.
And I guess we've talked about finance, we've talked about legislation and regulation. I guess now I want to talk about powers and the existing powers, because if we're all in agreement that we have to just crack on based on what's in place at the moment, because we can't afford to wait for legislation coming down the track, and I guess the inevitable question that Polly would have asked had she been here is, do local authorities actually know what powers they have? And I guess that's a rhetorical question, because I know that UK 100 did a power shift report which was researching into local authority powers relating to climate action. And I'm gonna address this to Jonathan in the first instance. In the Scottish context, we have 32 local authorities in Scotland. Jonathan, do you think they're all up to speed and have the capacity and full knowledge as to what's within their gift and what they can and can't do at the moment?
Again, I think probably within local authorities, then yes. I see the answer to that was yes. But it's probably in pockets within those local authorities. We've had experience of projects recently, as in within the last month, where the demand to meet net zero for a particular project of a scale is there, politically speaking and strategically. But when you start to get down to the actual delivery side of things and the consent side of things, there is still that hankering after the old policy. We're still using those. So I think there is still a requirement for people to understand and to learn what is required to go forward and what net zero actually means. But I think it's going to be something that's going to take the city leaders and governments to demonstrate that actually it's okay. It's okay to occasionally get things wrong. It's okay to trial new things, and it's okay to copy somebody else, even if they're in England, to do something and to do things differently, because that's the only way we're going to do this, is to find things that work and replicate them, find things that don't work and don't do them again, and do things at scale, but with speed as well, because otherwise we're going to be talking about this in 2030, not having delivered it.
I wholeheartedly agree, Jonathan. And Guy, from your perspective, I know you've got a view on this from the council's perspective and the question of capacity, because there have been a number of cuts over the years. Do we think there's the ability or capability in-house at the moment, or do local authorities need to gear up in terms of recruitment because the expertise just isn't there at the moment?
Yeah, so as you say, I think personal experience is that our council and the council leadership have great ambitions, and they're pitching it the right way. But in terms of the capability and ability to actually deliver, there is a shortfall there, and that's where we need to step up as businesses and support and help the councils deliver against the plans that they have. So that's part of our regulatory review at the moment, and our business plan moving forward, which we're currently negotiating with Ofgem. We've suggested and put forward what we're calling strategic optimizers, which are resources which talk to customers, which is obviously one of those customers is local authorities, and talk through the best way to develop infrastructure solutions, and do that in partnership with other utility providers. So we recognise there's a gap there, and we're trying to do something about it in our area. But I think if I generalise that a bit more, I think business does have a part to play here in terms of working with local councils and cities and making sure that we offer them benefit in kind support in these areas to develop business cases, for example. Just talked about that today in terms of projects. Give them our expertise and support in order to do that. In the medium to longer term, then I think there has to be a recognition these resources need to be restored to local authorities where there are gaps. But in the short term, I think we've got a part to play here as businesses to make sure that we're giving that support in the short term.
Thanks for that, Guy. I'm conscious that there's questions coming in thick and fast at the moment, so I'm going to try and rattle through them. One of them has commented, sounds like the starting model should be public purse for the first 10 years, 50-50 for the second 10 years, and then private sector thereafter. That sounds like quite a long period of time. And the question is, on that basis, how much additional tax revenue is required? Now, I'm not going to put anybody on the spot with that one, but it does raise the inevitable question about the consumer and all roads leading back to them ultimately. And you're nodding, Stephen, and you're on screen, so I'm going to ask you for your view first.
Well, it's a big white elephant in the room, isn't it? Who pays? It's the elephant in the room, right? Who pays? Now, someone's got to pay. The heat and building strategy, draft heat and building strategy for Scotland was talking about 33 billion. That's Scotland. I don't know the UK, but let's multiply by 10. That's just for buildings, yeah. Never mind transport, right? Now, someone's going to have to pay. The taxpayers are either going to have to pay, or the consumer's going to have to pay. But we want a just transition. But it's a political question, but we need to work out who's going to pay. It's not going to be financed by the public sector alone, because the numbers are too large. It's going to be the public sector leveraging in private sector investment. It's So no, I think we need to use the limited public subsidy we've got available to help and structure deals and incentivize them to attract in private sector investment. I think that's the aim for the next years till regulation comes in force. Then we probably need even less public sector subsidy, and we need much, it needs to shift much more to private sector. That would be my view.
can I ask the panel if anyone's got a differing view from that? I think the way the question was framed, I took slight fright because you add up the numbers and you're talking about at least 20 years, which from a 2021 start is an awful long period of time, and we've missed the 2030 target. Jonathan, do you have any views on this?
I do. It's something that we've put quite a lot of effort into just recently is long-term finance and working with the finance and investment sector, particularly the pension sector, looking for those long-term, stable and maybe not terribly exciting income streams, which is exactly where the pension sector likes to be. And that plays beautifully into the hands of decarbonising estates, particularly for the public sector. So those funds are there. They are massive and they are very, very patient. They're actively looking for projects to get involved in. I would say, my ex-colleague Stephen, we obviously spend a lot of time at the same barber. Slightly disagree with Stephen on the everything always needs to have public sector cash in it. I don't agree with that. I think sometimes in my past, over the years, actually public sector money can sometimes make a deal very complicated because it has an awful lot of red tape and bureaucracy that goes along with it. Whether that's real or whether it's imagined is two different things. So I think there is money there, but we need to look at that long-term finance piece and give the outcome that we require to the investment team and let them come back to us with a proposition rather than us or the public sector going to them with what they imagine is the proposition, because it might not be right.
I agree, Jonathan. We do, if we can do this with private finance and no public subsidy, let's get, in areas where we can, let's get on with it. Yeah, totally agree.
I'll pop round with a bag of cash later.
I'll cut your hair while you're here.
Right, let's see if we can get through a few more of these questions if the panel are up for it. One of the questions is, how are city leaders engaging with the population to get them on board? Now, I know that Edinburgh's just gone through a massive consultation process which was open to every resident in the city to give their views on sustainability strategy. But Shirley, would you mind if I asked you how you conducted that in London and how engaged the public were with you?
Yeah, so one of our big issues is that we can't do this to Londoners. We have to go where they want to take us, and actually they're telling us that they want us to go further and faster on air pollution, on climate, on inequalities. So how do we collectively work on those issues? And obviously for each and every initiative that we're bringing in, like the ultra low emission zone or some of the work we're doing on planning or whatever, we will do consultations. You've probably seen some of the debates in London about low traffic neighbourhoods and the sort of violent swings of opinion there are between them. But I think in the end it's about leadership, and holding your nerve, whether it's at mayoral level or at local level. You have to work with what's the evidence of what's the right thing. You're looking at the impacts for the general population, and sometimes that does require hard decisions. But that doesn't mean ignoring what people are saying. And on LTNs, for example, some of them have gone in not well and they need to be amended. Some have been taken out, but most of them are carrying on because they're actually working well, and people have recognised what a difference that makes. I think there's also value in demonstrator projects. To show people what does a 2030 city look like. So in London we've devised a programme called Future Neighbourhoods 2030. We are working with local authorities, communities, business improvement districts to get them to bid for a locality that they're going to show what a 2030 neighbourhood is like, and we'll be announcing that. Sadiq will be announcing the winners of that at later this year at COP, and those will act as showcases, I guess, of what is possible. But I think I can't remember who was saying earlier, but these aren't meant to be just demonstrated projects and that's it. These are about how do you use this, learn from them, and then how do you accelerate activity across the whole city. So this is part of that process. and that helps raise awareness of people about what can be done, what is possible, and also how they can get involved. Often these projects, and we want these projects to be led by the community, not by local authorities or businesses.
Thank you. And Guy, can I bring you in at this point just to talk about the position in Glasgow, because I know there's been a huge amount of work done with the initiatives that you've been involved in.
Yeah, sure, and I would echo what's been said, but also the same as Edinburgh, Glasgow have been involved in a very extensive stakeholder programme in terms of trying to get the citizens of Glasgow on board, and I think obviously having COP here definitely helps in terms of bringing it to the forefront. But I think the difficulty is that vulnerable communities in particular, while we've found that maybe 70 or 80% of people want to support the sustainability theme, it's just really down to whether you can afford it or not. At the end of the day, it's as simple as that. And I think we need to be persistent, and I agree 100%. We can't give up on this, and no matter how difficult it is in terms of a message with some communities, we need to keep going, and we need to find ways to protect those vulnerable communities, but at the same time keep pressing forward with the goals that we've got, because there is no option. It's patently obvious from the last few years in particular, in terms of the studies, etc., that have been done. So I think it's a huge challenge, but we just need to be brave and keep going. But we do need to make sure that we're protecting the vulnerable communities. And just a quick point on the cost. Obviously, in a regulated business, we have a good way of socialising costs across the wider population, especially for assets which are potentially could be depreciated over 50 years. That's a good way to spread costs and potentially for customers' bills not to be affected too much. But within that, you need to be extremely careful in terms of what projects are appropriate for that particular way of funding. And it can't be all of that, but it's definitely one way, and I think there needs to be a number of different solutions when it comes to funding. But certainly for assets which are long life assets, then that is a potential to kind of spread the cost over a longer period of time.
And I think, again, when it comes to things like grid infrastructure, that's where you can see the scale of the challenge, because the grid, I don't think I'm offending you, Guy, by saying that we know it's 100 years old and was constructed at a point in time where electric vehicles and hydrogen and all of these different clean energy solutions, offshore wind was a twinkle in someone's eye at that point. But to actually get to the stage of reinforcing all of that right across the UK will cost billions, and that in itself is an entirely different conversation about decarbonisation of cities, but it's an integral part of it, because all of the DNOs are in a position where they're looking at one another going, we know the scale of investment is enormous and we can't shoulder that on our own. I wasn't looking for a response unless you want to give one, Guy.
No, I could only agree.
I'm acutely aware of time. We've got about 7 minutes left, and I was saving this question to give everyone on this panel an opportunity to give their final thoughts and take a little bit of time about the things that they really want to see change. So the question is really, if there was one rule that you would change at national level that would unlock the decarbonisation of our communities, what would it be? And if I could start with Jonathan.
Sorry, I couldn't find my unmute button there. If there was one rule that I would change, it would be that not everything has to go through a procurement process that looks for the most economic option. And the reason that I say that is not because I feel that the public sector's got lots of money and should spend it on the private sector. That's not what I mean. What I mean is it should be looking to do the long-term right thing rather than the capital cost right thing. And they can be two different things. So look at long-term value of assets and investments and procure those rather than perhaps, I'm going to use the horrible word, the cheapest version, but rather the long-term best value prospect.
Thank you, Jonathan. Shirley, what's your take on this, having seen so much achieved in London, but a huge amount to still do? What would help?
I think for all of us, mandating that net zero carbon as part of your duty. So whether it's you talked about the infrastructure bank, you know, the GLA has a climate change duty, but not all local authorities do, not businesses, and so on. And I think, you know, if that was at the heart of it, that, you know, integrated with the Sustainable Development Goals or whatever, but even just simply net zero, I think, you know, people would think about what they do, you know, and how they can deliver on that, whether it's directly or indirectly through their supply chain, through procurement, and so on. And just thinking about it, measuring and monitoring it makes a big difference. So I think something like that would just embed that thinking.
Thank you. Stephen.
Hi, Claire. As doing an economics degree, albeit many years ago, for me it comes down to carbon pricing, because ultimately, if we got in place a proper carbon pricing mechanism that actually ensured that those that generate carbon pay more, then the point Jonathan made around business cases and things, it would really help with that. I personally don't think having gas as a solution in a business case for a public sector, I don't think it should be in there as an option anymore. I think it should just be ruled out as not being compliant. So carbon pricing for me, I'm allowed more than one. Carbon pricing, how we evaluate projects in the public sector, and I'm focusing public sector because I think they can drive this change and give the signalling to the supply chain to allow them to invest, but also just gas boilers generally, just strong regulation about when you build, whether you're building houses or replacing domestic, non-domestic. We should be sending the signal to the market that gas boilers are not going to be here in the medium or short to medium term, and that then we will get the investment in other technologies and heat pumps and supply chain. I'm not in charge, unfortunately, but that's what we do if I was.
And Guy, can I
don't
come
want
to
me
you?
in charge.
I didn't like to say, Stephen. Guy, can I come to you, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we need to delegate more power to local councils. If it takes cities, delegate more power to cities, but with that, comes great responsibility. Not to be too Spider-Man about it, but I think that we've talked already about cities need to take responsibility for planning, certainly in infrastructure that I've talked about, and they need to drive it. But I think the cities have more ambition than perhaps the UK government, and you can see that by some of the targets they're setting, and I think that's a great thing. And if we give them more power, then I think they can drive us along this road more quickly. So I guess that would be my one wish.
Excellent. And if I may, as chair, I think we've covered a huge amount today. I think my one wish, absent having that delegated authority to various devolved entities, we actually need to get together more. I have seen huge amounts of discussion and interaction between public and private sector through the Edinburgh Climate Commission and the Compact. I'm sure Guy will say that he's seen similar in Glasgow. And Shirley, with what you're doing in London, just getting people into a room to discuss the art of the possible and having people that are champions within their industry who are willing to take the leap forward to actually turn what Greta calls the blah, blah, blah into action, for me, is something that we absolutely need to prioritise, because as everyone has agreed today, we can't wait for that regulatory regime to fall into place. We can't wait for that legislation to fall into place. So I guess the call to action today is all of the cities across the UK to get together, to share that knowledge, to share that best practice, and actually to agree that absent the legislation, we can make a difference, and we need to make it now. There you go. That's me on my orange box as usual. Those who know me well, and there's quite a few in this call that know me well, I'm afraid I'm very passionate about this subject and hugely determined to see change. But unfortunately, that's all we've got time for, folks. We have run out of time, and I'm really sorry to say that, as I'd love to continue the debate. It's quite clear from the people we've heard from today that there's a huge amount of activity going on up there. And I guess what I'm worried about is just making sure that we leverage that as best we can, and that needs people to get together. I want to thank everyone for their attention today and for contributing to the debate. I apologise to those whose questions I haven't been able to answer. I'm afraid time has just beaten me. I want to thank all of the panel members for their insights and observations. And finally, if you feel as passionately as we do about the issues we've covered today and want to continue the conversation, then get in touch. We are all on LinkedIn. You can contact any of us. And I've said that without actually consulting any of my panel members. I'm sure they won't mind. But get in touch because we can only make a difference if we all get involved. And finally, I can confirm definitively that everyone on this panel today, including myself, is playing their part in trying to make a change. I challenge all of our audience to ask yourself, are you? And with that, I'll sign off. Thank you so much for your attention today and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.